Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Okay, welcome to World War III and the end of the world as we know it update. I haven't spoken to you for a while because we have enjoyed 7 days of a ceasefire in the Palestinian struggle in the Gaza Strip. So we had 7 days of a ceasefire. 100 Israeli hostages were released by Hamas. And we've been told erroneously that the hostages being held by Hamas were being tortured, beaten, raped, and murdered. However, the first-hand accounts of released hostages paint a very different picture. The hostages that were released by Hamas report that they were being held in the groups that they were taken in. So if they were taken from a kibbutz, a village, then that group was allowed to stay together. They were fed. They were provided with medicine when available. They were very studious about finding out who needed maintenance medications and making sure that they got the medications they needed, although they didn't get them every day because they did the best they could to find the medications to provide for the hostages. So the hostages report being allowed to commune together. They were not tortured, they were not beaten, and they were not starved. Although many of them lost weight, it was simply because there was less food, and they were more than likely being fed what the basic Hamas soldiers were also allowed to consume. So military rations, which aren't always the best, right? It's just barely enough to live. But they were fed and taken care of. At one point, Israeli propaganda news called some of these people liars and said that they were lying to protect Hamas or had been brainwashed by Hamas. But now the evidence is overwhelming that the prisoners, the hostages being held by Hamas, were actually treated humanely and given every possibility to maintain their health and well-being. And they were allowed to stay together. They were not separated. So they began to really feel like they were still a community, even though they were in captivity, because they were being held all together with the people they came with. So the other captives from their village or area were there with them. And this is what we've discovered now, that the hostages have been released and they're speaking. The bombing resumed this morning. The breakdown tends to be along the lines of the Hamas saying the Israelis started it, and the Israelis saying the Hamas started it. But in reality, it just appears that negotiations broke down, and the demands of Israel were not going to be met by Hamas, and they reached a loggerhead, and both parties resumed the war this morning. So once again, we're seeing images of little children who are being dragged from the rubble, bodies, injured children, injured women, and the massacre of the Palestinians is now continuing. So this leads to the concept of what's next. I think as this progresses, I'm going to be looked upon more and more like a prophet, because I have predicted very much of the things that have occurred. And I had said all along since the beginning of this, nearly 50 days ago, that the intention of the Israelis, the secret intention of the Israelis, is to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza completely, either killing them or driving them into the Sinai Desert in Egypt. And I told you that they would move the line and tell them move south, then move the line and go move south of this line, and then move the line again and go move south of this line. So the city of Khan Yunis, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but the city just south of Gaza City is where most people ran to. And today they dropped pamphlets on that city telling them to move further south, because now they're going to start bombing Khan Yunis. And we'll all know how to pronounce that before this is over, because this is the next leg in the military campaign. We know from interviews and footage released of Netanyahu speaking to the troops at the beginning of this truce, that their intention never was to turn this ceasefire into any kind of long-term truce, that they were not going to abandon their military objective of completely destroying Hamas. And I believe that that's just a cover for their true intention, which is to drive all Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and into the Sinai Desert and kill the ones who refuse to go. And but Netanyahu met with the troops on day one of the truce, ensuring them that this is not the end of the military campaign, that it was just a momentary pause while they tried to negotiate the release of hostages. And I believe that Netanyahu's government and the military were never concerned with hostages until the families of the hostages began to openly protest and demand that the government do something to retrieve their family members. And all along, Hamas kidnapped these people to begin with for the sole purpose of exchanging them for Palestinian prisoners. And, you know, there are some 7,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of them women and children, being held in Israeli prisons. And so there was a large number of Palestinians exchanged for a smaller number of Israeli hostages. They met at a loggerhead and couldn't get past it, and now fighting has resumed. But Netanyahu on day one said that this is not the end. Just stand by, it's a momentary break. And it does appear that even though the bombing stopped in northern Gaza, that the Israelis took this opportunity of being able to move about without receiving fire from Hamas to move their tanks and equipment further in and dig in deeper in northern Gaza. That if any of you had hopes that this ceasefire would turn into something more, into a long-term truce or some kind of negotiated end, I hate to disappoint you. That's not on the menu for the Israelis. They fully intend to destroy all of Gaza, and they're going to keep driving the people further south. So Khan Yunis is no longer a safe zone. They proved that by hitting it this morning with multiple bombings and a continued bombing campaign in Gaza City. And this will intensify, and the tanks will continue to roll south until Khan Yunis is also under the control of the Israeli army, the IDF. And the people will be driven further and further into the southern portion of Gaza until they are all huddled at the gate into Egypt. And then international pressure on Egypt will cause them to open up immigration and allow the Gazan refugees to exit the Gaza Strip, at which point Israel will take full control of Gaza. They have already shown that when they take an area, they come in directly behind the troops once the area is secured with that's what I'm looking for, demolition squads. And they're coming in with heavy equipment, demolishing all the buildings and houses and apartment buildings. And anything left standing after the bombing is being razed to the ground by bulldozers. And this is going to continue south until there's nothing left of the Gaza Strip. And even though there was a ceasefire in Gaza for the last 7 days, the war in the north with Hezbollah has continued. They've continued exchanging rockets and tank rounds and artillery rounds back and forth across the border between northern Israel and southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah fighters and the IDF engaged in open warfare. Also, Israel has stepped up its attacks into Syria, targeting Hezbollah and other what they call resistance groups that are related to Hezbollah and Hamas in Syria, and they've been attacking them with airstrikes, as have the United States been attacking also in Syria and in Iraq any of these Shia-aligned, Iranian-aligned resistance groups like Hezbollah and its related groups, which includes the Houthis in Yemen. Also, we had an Israeli, they say an Israeli ship, but it was an internationally owned ship that happened to have Israeli investments in it as well. I believe it was a car carrier that either right before the ceasefire or during the ceasefire was taken by Yemeni pirates who descended upon the bridge of the ship from a helicopter and took it over without a shot being fired or anyone being harmed. Since it was a civilian vessel, there was no armed resistance, and they claimed in an act of piracy this international car carrier who was partially owned by Israeli businessmen. And since then, the United States Navy has thwarted several attempts at piracy at the hands of the Yemeni Houthis, which are an Iranian allied resistance force that's been guilty of firing missiles at United States ships, at United States troops in the region, and also aiming missiles at Tel Aviv. And I don't believe any have made it through into Tel Aviv, but we may have had a few drones that got past the Iron Dome. So what we have is a broadening of the regional conflict. Turkey has been watching. We have not heard much from Erdogan. I can never pronounce that man's name. We're going to all know these names by heart before this war is over. And in other news, other than this looking like it's going to expand into a regional conflict there in the Middle East, we have an interesting development out of North Korea. North Korea recently, just a few days ago, launched into orbit successfully a spy satellite. And according to a Pentagon spokesperson during a recent press conference, the satellite in question, he said, and I quote, contained ballistic missile technology. Now, whether this was a guidance system, whether this was somehow related to targeting for ballistic missile operations, or whether this is a satellite that actually contains a ballistic missile capability, is still undetermined, and no more information, as far as I know, has come out about it. But an interesting thing occurred just the day after the launching and the successful orbit. When it was a stable orbit was maintained by this North Korean satellite, the leader of China made a statement urging restraint by all parties involved. Now, this is disturbing because this implies that someone needs to be restrained. Was it asking for the United States to show restraint and not engage this satellite? You know, this is, a lot of people laughed at Trump for putting together the Space Force, but this is exactly the sort of thing the Space Force was implemented and designed to handle. And so now we have, whether this is a weapons platform, a spy satellite, which is what North Korea claims it is, or whether it's actually a weapon that's been put into space. Now, this brings to mind the threat of EMP, electromagnetic pulse. We have said that it's very difficult for a country like North Korea to shoot a missile over the continental United States and have an airburst in the lower atmosphere that would cause a electromagnetic pulse that would disable our power grid, destroy much of our electronic infrastructure, and potentially lead to millions of Americans' deaths. Up to 90%, I've heard, of Americans would perish just because of the lack of electricity and vehicles and other necessary infrastructure that supports our modern lifestyle. So were the Chinese telling the Koreans, the North Koreans, to show restraint and not EMP the United States? Or was that a reference to a potential retaliation against the satellite by the United States Space Force? I do not know. I just find it very interesting that this was mentioned, and that restraint was necessary. If it's just a spy satellite, then I don't think the United States would risk getting engaged in open warfare with North Korea over a spy satellite. But the Pentagon spokesperson claimed that it contained ballistic missile technology without any more clarification on what that means. Now, a ballistic missile could be launched from a satellite. Many people believe the United States has this capability, and that we have ballistic missile platforms and anti-ballistic missile platforms already orbiting space under a program of super secrecy that was supposed to have been voted down by Congress, but went ahead anyway under Black Ops, which is the concept of a Star Wars program, a program of space-based weapons platforms. So does North Korea now have a space-based weapons program? And will the United States do something to the North Koreans to eliminate this potential threat? Or is this a platform to launch an EMP? On this channel, we've done a lot of talking about EMPs, and an EMP could be launched from a balloon. We did have those spy balloons that were shot down over various portions of the central part of the United States here about a year ago or so. And there was a lot of concern that those were dry runs for an EMP, a rehearsal for an EMP attack from a high altitude balloon, but a satellite would be a much better source of getting a very precise burst, a nuclear burst in the stratosphere that would cause an electromagnetic pulse to disable every electronic device in North America, or most of the United States at least. There are some areas that are so far away, like the very northeastern and northwestern parts of the country, that might not face total destruction from an EMP, but make no doubt about it, the entire power grid would go down. And some say that any hopes of it being restored within a year are ridiculous, and that most say it's a 3 to 5 year blackout for the United States, which would result in 90% of people losing their lives, mainly due to starvation, lack of water, and barbaric outbreaks of violence and lawlessness. So in the event of an EMP, people who live in the country who have some level of sustainability will probably be amongst the 10%, and the 90% that will perish will mostly be the city dwellers who are incapable of providing for themselves apart from the trucking system and the grocery store system and the electronics that they all rely on. So there is your update. That is the major hot spots on what's going on right now. And I encourage you, if you're a viewer of this channel, to tune in to a discussion that I'm about to have on end times eschatology, and talk about the impact of a thing called Christian Zionism, and also look at end time eschatology and the different versions of it throughout Christianity, and where I finally might have settled when it comes to that topic. So make sure and catch that series that's going to be released probably this coming week, and as well as the new series on who is the Holy Spirit, our examination of the Trinity. And I hope to see you on the channel. I want to encourage you to support this channel. If you get something from this channel, whether it's spiritual guidance, insight into world events, or simply coffee talks about strange and unusual occurrences in the world and conspiracy theories, please consider making a contribution to this channel. December and January is always the really skinny times around here, where I tend to go without and have to get by with less, because everyone's spending money for the holidays and family. So if you have ever thought about contributing, now is a great time to start contributing to help make up for that loss that I have every year at this time. And I usually get pretty broke by the end of January. So any help is greatly considered, is greatly appreciated rather. And you know, I want to let you know that this is not a big channel. I'm a guy that lives in a cabin in the woods, and all of the money that comes into this channel just goes to pay my light bill and keep food in my cabinets and gas in my car. And I live very low, and I live very much below the poverty level. So any help that you can offer to this channel is greatly appreciated. And we'll see you next time, and hopefully it's not the end of the world as we know it.